On Paramount's biggest soundstage, two Hollywood legends were about to face each other. One was William Wyler, three-time Oscar winner, architect of patience and precision, a director who crafted every frame like a painting. The other was Kirk Douglas, like a wolf starving for recognition, grabbing audiences by the throat every time he appeared on screen. The rising star who had torn through Hollywood with Champion. Both were right. Both were perfectionists. Both loved cinema in different ways. But on the detective story set, they would learn that sometimes two truths cannot exist in the same place at the same time. Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary story, if you want to discover more untold Hollywood stories like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Now, let's go back to that spring day in 1951. The morning light filtered through the massive windows of Paramount Stage 12, casting long shadows across what would become one of cinema's most memorable battlegrounds. William Wyler arrived first, as he always did, carrying his worn leather script binder and wearing the same gray cardigan he'd worn on the sets of Mrs. Miniver and The Best Years of Our Lives. At 49, Wyler had already achieved what most directors only dream of: 3 Academy Awards and the respect of an entire industry. But respect wasn't the same as ease. Every film Wyler made was a test of endurance, patience, and obsessive attention to detail that could break even the strongest spirits. Kirk Douglas entered the soundstage 45 minutes later with the energy of a lightning bolt contained in human form. At 35, he was Hollywood's most explosive new talent, still riding the wave of acclaim from Champion. His chin dimple had become iconic, his intensity legendary, and his ambition limitless. Douglas didn't walk on his sets. He claimed them, filled them with his presence until every person in the room understood that something significant was happening. The detective story was supposed to be a prestige project, an adaptation of Sidney Kingsley's hit Broadway play about a detective whose rigid sense of justice destroys everything he loves. It was exactly the kind of material Wyler excelled at. Morally complex, emotionally layered, requiring subtle, controlled performance that revealed inner turmoil through the smallest gestures. Douglas had fought hard for the role, wanting to prove he could deliver what Wyler demanded: restraint, nuance, precision. But wanting to do something and being able to do it were two different things. Wyler's method was legendary in Hollywood, spoken about in hushed tones by actors who had survived it. He believed in repetition as excavation, digging deeper with each take until he unearthed something raw and true that even the actor didn't know existed within them. Bette Davis had wept on his sets. Laurence Olivier had questioned his own talent. The director's trademark was silence. He would watch a take, say nothing, and simply call for another. Sometimes 20 takes, sometimes 30. Once, famously 47. Douglas had been trained in the American school of emotional immediacy. His approach was to locate truth in the first burst of feeling, to trust his instincts and his body's memory of emotion. When Douglas acted, audiences felt it in their chests, their throats, their clenched fists. He didn't whisper his performances, he declared them. But the detective story wasn't that kind of film. MacLeod was a man whose rage was turned inward, corroding his soul in silence. He smiled while dying inside, maintained control while falling apart. It required exactly the kind of internalized, minimalist performance that went against every instinct Douglas had cultivated. The first week proceeded with cautious optimism. Douglas would deliver scenes with commitment and power. Wyler would watch, his face unreadable, then quietly say the words every actor dreaded: "Let's do it again." By the second week, tension was building. Douglas was giving what he believed were strong, truthful performances. Wyler was politely, persistently asking for something different. But what? Douglas would modulate his voice, another take. Reduce his gestures, another take. Play it colder, warmer, somewhere in between, another take, another take, another take. Eleanor Parker, playing MacLeod's wife, watched with growing concern. This wasn't cruelty from Wyler. It was a genuine search for something specific he couldn't articulate but would know when he saw it. And from Douglas, this wasn't ego. It was the frustration of an artist who genuinely couldn't understand what was being asked. The key scene arrived on day 12. MacLeod discovers a truth about his wife's past that shatters his rigid worldview. Everything hinged on this moment. Douglas prepared with his usual intensity, researching extensively, working with the dialogue until he could deliver it with his eyes closed. When Wyler called action, Douglas gave what he believed was the performance of his career. Raw, powerful, devastated. Wyler looked through the camera for a long moment. Then, let's do it again. Douglas composed himself and did it again. Different this time, more controlled, channeling devastation through clenched jaw and rigid posture. When Wyler called cut, Douglas looked expectantly. Again, the pattern continued. Take 3, 4, 5. Douglas tried every variation. Louder, softer, faster, slower, standing, sitting, moving still. With each take, he searched for whatever Wyler saw in his mind's eye. With each, again, the pressure increased. Take 15 arrived with late afternoon sun slanting through the windows. The crew had gone silent, watching with horrified fascination. Douglas was no longer just performing. He was fighting against invisible constraints he couldn't identify, but could feel tightening with every repetition. Wyler remained perfectly calm, perfectly patient. This was his process, refined over decades. He knew resistance was part of the journey, that actors had to break through their own habits to reach something deeper. What he didn't fully appreciate was how Douglas's entire identity was built on trusting those instincts. Take 20. Douglas felt something breaking inside him, not positively, but like a foundation cracking. He had always been confident about his abilities. But now, for the first time, he was doubting himself. Was he not good enough for this kind of film? Had he been wrong to push for this role? Between takes 25 and 26, Douglas walked off the set. Not in anger, but because he needed air, needed to understand what was happening. He found himself in the alley behind the soundstage, cool evening air hitting his face. William Wyler followed him out. The two men stood in silence, muffled sounds of Hollywood traffic providing backdrop to their unspoken confrontation. What happened next would be remembered differently by both men in later years, but the essence remained consistent. They talked. Really talked, perhaps for the first time since production began. Wyler explained what he was searching for, not a big emotional release, but the moment just before. The tension of holding everything in while it tears you apart from inside. The face that stays composed while the soul screams. He told Douglas about watching his own father deal with devastating news, how the older man had simply nodded, said, "I see," and quietly excused himself. It was in that restraint, Wyler believed, that the deepest truth lived. Douglas listened, and something shifted. He had been trying to show the emotion, to display the devastation. But Wyler wanted him to hide it, to fight against showing it, so audiences would feel the struggle itself. It wasn't about less acting. It was about acting against the emotion instead of with it. When they returned to the soundstage, something had changed. Douglas understood now that Wyler wasn't trying to diminish his performance, but redirect its power inward. And Wyler had gained new appreciation for how Douglas's instinctive approach contained its own truth that shouldn't be completely suppressed but channeled. Take 27 was different. Douglas played the scene with his usual commitment, but this time actively working against the impulse to release emotion. He let it build in his throat, his chest, behind his eyes, and held it there. His jaw muscles tightened. His hands gripped the desk edge until knuckles went white. His voice went flat and cold in that particular way voices do when someone uses every ounce of control to keep from falling apart. Wyler watched through the camera. When he called cut, he didn't immediately call for another take. He stood, walked to Douglas, and simply nodded. "That's it. That's the truth I was looking for." The remainder of the shoot proceeded with new understanding. It wasn't easy. Wyler still pushed for multiple takes. Douglas still sometimes struggled against instincts. But they had found a language to communicate across different philosophies. Douglas learned to trust that Wyler's repetition wasn't rejection, but refinement. Wyler learned to recognize when Douglas had found something genuine, even if it didn't look exactly like what he'd envisioned. Years later, Kirk Douglas would write about the detective story as one of the most challenging but ultimately rewarding experiences of his career. He acknowledged that working with Wyler had fundamentally changed his understanding of film acting, teaching him that the camera could see suppressed emotions that were somehow more powerful than grand gestures. William Wyler would tell interviewers that Kirk Douglas had been difficult but brilliant, capturing both the struggle and mutual respect. He never worked with Douglas again, not because of lingering animosity, but because their collaboration had been so intense, so complete, that it didn't need repeating. The film received critical acclaim when it opened in November 1951. Critics particularly praised Douglas's performance, noting new depth and restraint that showcased his range. Eleanor Parker received an Oscar nomination. The film was nominated for Best Director, Best Screenplay, and Best Supporting Actress for Lee Grant's film debut. But the real legacy wasn't in awards or box office. It was in what it represented, a moment when two different approaches to truth collided and, instead of destroying each other, created something neither man could have achieved alone. Wyler's precision had focused Douglas's power. Douglas's intensity had brought life to Wyler's control. In decades that followed, both men would continue legendary careers. Douglas would go on to Spartacus, Lust for Life, Paths of Glory, performances balancing his natural intensity with internalized complexity learned on the detective story set. Wyler would make Ben-Hur, The Big Country, continuing his tradition of meticulous perfection. They would see each other occasionally at industry events, always cordial, always respectful. There were no dramatic reconciliations because there had never been a dramatic falling out. Just two artists who had pushed each other to uncomfortable places and emerged better for it. The story became Hollywood legend, told and retold with varying accuracy. Some versions emphasize conflict, turning it into a simple story of ego clashes. But those who were actually there understood it differently. This wasn't about who was right or who won. It was about what happens when two people who are both right have to find a way to exist in the same truth. It was about the painful but necessary process of growth that comes from being challenged by someone who sees the world differently. It was about respect earned through struggle, understanding achieved through conflict, and art created not despite differences, but because of them. In the end, what William Wyler and Kirk Douglas gave each other was exactly what every artist needs and fears in equal measure. They gave each other a mirror that showed not just who they were, but who they could become.